What is your duty if you witness a crime? It's been a hot topic of debate here in Utah and across the country. For more on that topic, we turn to University of Utah law professor and author Amos Guiora. Amos, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Glenn, always good to see you, and thanks for having me on the show.
Let's start off by setting up this segment for us. We've seen some high-profile cases across the country on this very topic, but give us a little background of how we got to this point where this has become such a debate all across the country.
I think, Glenn, that primarily it's become a hot debate, as you correctly note, in the last couple of years more than in the past. I think primarily because of the sexual assaults at Michigan State, Ohio State, USA Gymnastics, obviously Penn State, the Catholic Church. I think that has brought to the forefront the question of what is the duty we owe to the person in peril. As you know, you may recall you were gracious enough to have me on your show a couple of years ago when my previous book, The Crime of Complicity, came out, when we talked about the bystander, first of all, in the context of the Holocaust, and then in society today. The new book, The Armies of Enablers, expands on that and looks at the role of enablers in the context of sexual assaults. And I think you are 100% right that these high-profile, primarily sexual assault cases, you know, whether it's also Harvey Weinstein, Epstein perhaps, that really has forced the public to address, at least to ask, the critical question of what is the duty we owe to the person in peril. And if, you know, these two books together are forcing that debate, and shows like yours, from my perspective, it's really forcing us to ask, what is the duty we owe to the other person?
Okay, we're going to get more into your new book, Armies of Enablers, in just a second, and more into this conversation. But first, I want to know, you have been on a crusade, if you will, for this very issue. Why has it become so important to you to where you're writing these books, you're having these conversations, and you're even pushing for legislation on Utah's Capitol Hill? Why did you get behind this?
Because survivors have trusted me with their stories, and they've humbled me and they've honored me. And I said to them, because you have humbled me and honored me, in return, I will speak to anyone. I will be involved in any effort to bring to the public's attention the consequences of the enabler. And because I don't know any other word, Glenn, but they've trusted me with their terrible stories. And I think the least I can do is to fight that good fight on their behalf, not with respect to the perpetrator, but with respect to the enabler.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk more about the role of the enabler there. When you hear these stories, are you hearing people say, you know, so-and-so could have stopped this, or, you know, this other person could have stopped this? How does that conversation go, and how are they looking at those enablers in these situations?
Great question, Glenn. When I started the book and started interviewing the survivors, I was evidently the first person who asked them the following question, which is, what were your expectations of the enabler? People had focused on the perpetrator. I don't focus on the perpetrator. And I think that for the survivors, the opportunity to really examine, discuss the role of the enabler was a very different way of looking at that. And one of the things, frankly, that's occurred since the book came out in September is I literally daily am receiving phone calls and emails, whatever, from survivors around the world who have heard me speak, have read the book. They don't want to talk about the perpetrator. They want to talk about the enabler. I think that this raises a very different question than just the person who attacked, not to minimize that. But the more important question, perhaps the more profound question, is that the enabler facilitates the perpetrator acting with impunity. And if we can directly address, if not attack, the enabler / bystander, I think that's going to make a major, major shift in how we view sexual assaults, whether it's on college campuses, sports teams, the military, religious institutions. I mean, from institution to institution, this is going to require a significant / profound cultural shift. If my book, you know, can play a role in that, then I will have, I think, from the perspective of the survivors, have honored them because they humbled me.
Okay, let's come back to that cultural shift you referred to, but first, when we hear perpetrator, we all know what that means. Define enabler for us. What does that look like? What is going on in those situations? Paint a clear picture for us here.
Best example I can give you, because I discussed it in the book, is there was a woman who was the captain of the Michigan State University gymnastics team, and she had been assaulted by Larry Nassar, the same doctor who assaulted at Michigan State and the USA Gymnastics. And she, after a number of years of being assaulted by Nassar, decides enough is enough. She goes to her coach, And she says to the coach, I'm going to the police because enough. I now know this is assault and not medical care. And the coach says to her three things. One, that if you go to the police, I'm going to have to talk to your parents. And that's absolutely incorrect. Two, I want you to think about how this will impact Larry and his family. Also absolutely incorrect. And three, she says to the athlete, I remind you, scholarships are given and scholarships are taken. That's what an enabler does. An enabler creates the environment, clearly and directly, whereby the survivor has no one to turn to. What the enabler does is they protect the institution and protect the perpetrator. That is the sin of the enabler, and that's why I genuinely believe that that is something that we need to have a long discussion about, criminalizing it, because the consequences from the survivor's perspective is that it enables the perpetrator to continue committing their terrible crimes unabated.
Okay, you make the argument of institutional complicity. You just laid out a perfect example for us right there. You mentioned earlier in this interview the need for a cultural shift. How does that happen moving forward?
I think by leadership understanding that there will be accountability if they continue to be enablers and if they tolerate enablers. And that accountability goes well beyond, everybody likes to do the workshops and have the conversations. That's far from enough, Glenn. We need to hold people accountable. Does that mean that perhaps people lose their jobs? Yes. Does that mean that people are penalized? Yes. Does that mean that people are sanctioned? Yes. Does that mean that people are criminalized? Yes. Otherwise, from the perspective of the survivor or the survivors, there'll be no change whatsoever. And we all read the so-called press releases, the mantras about the need to protect the vulnerable. That's just spin, if you will. I'm a firm believer, and so are the survivors, that the age of spinning needs to come to an end. And we need to have a shift here whereby we hold people accountable for being enablers, and we hold senior people responsible for tolerating enablers. And I add, if the senior people are themselves the enablers, then they too must be pushed out the door. This is, for me, is a black-white, because if we continue to tolerate it, then what happened at Michigan State, Penn State, Ohio State, will happen elsewhere tomorrow morning. And
okay.
If I could just go ahead, sorry.
Professor, we have about a minute 30 left, so I want to get real quick on legislation you're working on here in the state of Utah. The past few years, you've been advocating for legislation to have legal consequences here. Give us a brief summary of what the bill this year on the table that Utah legislators are considering would do.
The bill that has been, thanks to Representative Brian King, in front of the Utah legislature, would criminalize the bystander. It would be part of the Utah criminal code. We actually already have this with respect to children and vulnerable adults. The idea is to add on to that, to exactly as you say, to hold the bystander liable from a criminal perspective by codifying it. There are 10 other states that already have this. There are about 28 countries that have this. And the idea really is to understand that the bystander is not a moral sin or an ethical failing. It's a crime because of the consequences from the perspective of the person in peril. One final word. For me, the primary focus, both in the context of the enabler and the bystander, is a powerful shift in the conversation, that we view this through the lens of the survivor. They are the most important person in the discussion.
All right, the bill has not passed the legislature the last couple of years. We will keep an eye on it as we come down the stretch this year. Professor Guiara, always great to have your insight. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so very much. Bye-bye.
We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break.